The smell of jet fuel hung thick in the air as sunlight bounced off the polished floors of LAX International. Gate 12 pulsed with tension. Heels clicked across marble tiles, boarding announcements cut sharply through the intercom, and passengers clutched lattes like lifelines in the morning rush. But then, like a needle scratching across a symphony, came a sound that stopped everything. A slap. Loud, jarring. Final, gasps echoed. A cane clattered against tile, heads whipped around just in time to see a tall young flight attendant standing rigid, eyes blazing, hand still raised, while an elderly black woman stared back at her, unmoved, her composure terrifying in its silence. She didn't flinch, she didn't step back. Instead, she slowly bent to retrieve her fallen cane, her emerald coat swaying gently with the motion. And when she rose, she looked the woman square in the eyes and said only this: "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life." No one knew it yet, not the stunned gate agent, not the whispering passengers, and certainly not the furious flight attendant. But the woman they had just dismissed wasn't here to board a plane. She owned it. And before the flight ever left the ground, reputations would be shattered, careers would burn, and a long-buried truth would rise like smoke from the wreckage of arrogance. This is the story of Evelyn Sinclair and the day the skies bowed to her silence. The camera sweeps across Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, its steel and glass glinting in the harsh California sun. Inside, terminal lights flicker overhead like the ticking of a clock wound too tight. Everything feels on edge. TSA lines snake around chrome dividers. Announcements bark through speakers. A child cries somewhere in the distance, and no one notices, because this is routine chaos and no one dares fall behind the rhythm. But as the lens cuts closer, the rhythm falters. Enter Evelyn Sinclair, 64, black, poised. She steps onto the polished floor like she owns the air beneath her feet. And maybe, just maybe, she does. Her emerald coat catches the light with every stride. A carved cane, gripped firmly in her right hand, taps against the marble. Not for support, but rhythm, precision, power. Her salt and pepper curls are swept into a soft chignon. She looks like grace wrapped in authority. The camera pans to a young woman in a Navy flight attendant uniform, adjusting her scarf with robotic precision. Madison Clark, 29, blonde, meticulous, and utterly unaware she's about to collide headfirst with a moment that will unravel everything she believes. Their paths cross outside Gate 12. Madison nearly crashes into Evelyn, distracted by her tablet scanning boarding data. She stops, looks up, then pauses. Just a beat. But it's enough. Her eyes flick down Evelyn's coat, over the cane, to her worn leather carry-on. Her expression doesn't shift, but something in her posture hardens. Her voice is syrupy, but cold. "Ma'am, first class is boarding now. This area is restricted." Evelyn doesn't blink, doesn't move. "I'm aware," she replies evenly. "That's where I'm headed." The moment should end there, but it doesn't. Not in Madison's mind. Not in a world where authority is draped in Armani and whiteness. Not vintage cashmere and black skin. She takes a breath, squares her shoulders, and steps in front of Evelyn, fully blocking the boarding lane. "I'll need to see your ticket. Now." A hush creeps in, like fog curling low across a field. Evelyn doesn't raise her voice, doesn't plead. She simply reaches into her coat pocket, slowly, deliberately. But before the leather wallet even emerges, the damage is already done. The look in Madison's eyes says it all: you don't belong here. And somewhere, just off camera, the story shifts. A reckoning takes root, and the skies, once neutral, begin to tremble. The tension at Gate 12 thickened like a storm pressing against glass, silent but electric. Evelyn Sinclair stood still, her back straight, her gaze calm yet commanding. Her boarding pass remained untouched in her hand, but she made no move to hand it over. Not yet. Not while being treated like a trespasser in a space she helped build. Madison Clark's jaw tensed. She was used to control, used to passengers folding under protocol and polished contempt. But this woman, this poised, silent force in an emerald coat, was unmoved. That stillness, it was unbearable. Passengers nearby began to sense the shift. A few slowed their steps, Others turned discreetly, pretending to adjust carry-ons or fidget with phones. But their eyes stayed locked on the two women locked in a standoff. "Do you have a problem complying?" Madison said, louder this time. Her voice rang clear across the gate area, calculated to be heard. She stepped closer, an edge creeping into her tone. "We've had issues with people trying to sneak into first class lately." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, not in offense, but disbelief. "Is that what you think this is?" "I think," Madison snapped, "that if you had a legitimate ticket, you wouldn't be hesitating." And then it happened. Evelyn reached forward calmly to offer the pass. Madison lunged faster, her hand swiping out, sharp, impatient, disrespectful, but she didn't grab the ticket. Her fingers slapped against Evelyn's wrist, hard. The sound was unmistakable. A sharp crack, like a firecracker going off in church. Gasps. A stroller stopped mid-roll. A coffee cup tipped onto the floor. Evelyn's wooden cane slipped from her grip, clattering against the tile. The echo was haunting. It sounded less like wood, more like dignity being discarded. For a split second, time fractured. Madison's breath caught. Her hand trembled, betraying the confidence she wore like armor, but Evelyn didn't flinch, didn't recoil. She slowly bent down, picked up the cane, and straightened up with an elegance so complete it made Madison look juvenile by comparison. Their eyes locked. Evelyn's gaze didn't scream, it didn't accuse, it sliced, clean and cold, as if staring directly into the part of Madison that she'd spent her life avoiding. The part where fear dressed up as superiority. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life," Evelyn said, voice soft enough to make people lean in. "And you don't even know it yet." Behind them, a young businessman had begun filming. A middle-aged woman covered her mouth in shock. The air itself felt thinner. And Madison, still standing with her arms stiff, chest heaving, had no idea that her slap wouldn't just echo across Gate 12. It would reverberate across the entire industry. The silence that followed Evelyn's words felt unnatural, like the world had hit pause. Madison Clark stood frozen, her hand still tingling from the contact, her heart hammering with a cocktail of adrenaline and denial. Around her, the terminal had become a living tableau. Every eye locked on her, every breath seemed to belong to Evelyn. But Evelyn didn't linger. She turned, calm and composed, and began walking toward the gate attendant. The way she moved, unhurried, regal, sent a shiver through the crowd. Madison didn't follow immediately. She couldn't. Something in her gut twisted as if warning her, "You've gone too far." That's when he arrived. A man in a charcoal suit cut through the crowd like a scalpel. Richard Gaines, Senior Vice President of Operations at Attendant Airways, moved with the efficiency of a man who had cleaned up many messes. But never one like this. "Where is she?" he asked a stunned flight supervisor near the gate. Someone pointed, and then Richard saw her. The moment he locked eyes with Evelyn Sinclair, his expression shifted. From focused professionalism to sudden, unmistakable reverence, the type reserved for heads of state or royalty. He approached her and, without hesitation, bowed his head slightly. "Chairwoman Sinclair," he said, voice low but clear, "on behalf of the entire airline, I extend our deepest apologies for what just occurred." The room didn't just gasp, it snapped. The name hit like lightning. Sinclair, Evelyn Sinclair. Some passengers blinked, trying to process what they'd just heard. Others whispered furiously, fumbling for their phones. A handful already knew the name etched on the founding documents of Attendant Airways. The CEO, the founder, the woman who built the company from the ground up after being denied a promotion in a competitor airline 2 decades ago. Madison's knees nearly buckled. She stumbled forward, her voice dry. "Wait, she's—" Richard didn't even look at her. He turned to the gate agent and gestured firmly. "Hold the flight," he ordered, "and notify legal. We'll be conducting a full incident review." Then finally, he faced Madison, eyes steel, jaw tight. "Miss Clark," he said, every syllable weighted with consequence, "you didn't just assault a passenger. You assaulted your boss, the woman who signs your checks, and the face of the company you claim to represent." Madison's world tilted sideways. Blood drained from her face. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Evelyn, meanwhile, simply stood tall beside her cane, silent, composed, and devastatingly powerful. She didn't gloat, she didn't blink, because she didn't need to. The truth was out, the mask was off, and the reckoning had just begun. 2 hours later, far from the hum of the departure gate, Madison Clark sat in a frost-glass conference room on the top floor of Ascendant Airways' executive wing. Her uniform, once pristine, now felt like a costume. Her hands, which had once gestured with confidence in first-class cabins, were clenched tightly in her lap. Her badge sat face down on the table in front of her, stripped of meaning. Across from her sat Stephen Caldwell, head of human resources, and Richard Gaines, still simmering with controlled fury. But the room only truly shifted when Evelyn Sinclair stepped inside. She didn't storm in, she didn't slam the door. She entered with that same unsettling grace, the kind that didn't need to demand attention. It commanded it. No one spoke for a moment. Evelyn's heels tapped softly on the marble, each step echoing like a judge's gavel. Then she spoke. "I'm not here to punish you out of ego, Miss Clark. That's too easy, and frankly, it changes nothing." Her voice was calm, but it cut through the air like a scalpel. "I'm here to challenge the very root of what allowed this to happen." Madison swallowed hard, her voice small. "I didn't know who you were." "That's the point," Evelyn interrupted gently. "You didn't care to know, because in your eyes, I didn't look like I belonged. And that is a failure far deeper than protocol." Stephen leaned forward, clasping his hands. "Miss Clark, your conduct violates multiple policies: physical aggression, public defamation, racial bias. Termination is not only justified, it's expected. But Chairwoman Sinclair has proposed an alternative." Madison's brows furrowed. "Alternative?" Evelyn nodded. "You're being offered a 6-month probation period. No flights, no uniform. Instead, you'll enter a full-time cultural re-education program on racial equity, unconscious bias, and ethical service. And," Stephen added, "your progress will be reported directly to Mrs. Sinclair." Madison blinked. "You're not firing me?" Evelyn tilted her head. "Would that make you understand? Or just resent? Because I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in change." Madison looked down, her voice cracking. I don't deserve that kind of grace." "No," Evelyn replied, "you don't. Not yet. But if you're willing to face the truth, willing to listen, really listen, and rebuild from it, then maybe, just maybe, you can become part of the solution instead of the problem." The silence in the room now wasn't tense. It was full of weight, of choice, of possibility. Madison nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "I'll do it. I'll face it all." Evelyn gave a faint, approving smile. "Good. Because your journey doesn't start with redemption. It starts with reckoning." And as she stood to leave, Madison knew the hardest flight she'd ever take wouldn't leave from a runway. It would begin right here, within herself. The next morning, long before sunrise kissed the skyline of downtown Los Angeles, Madison Clark stood outside a modest glass building on Wilshire Boulevard. A small sign above the door read, "Institute for Cultural Accountability and Equity Training." There were no marble floors, no chrome finishes, no first-class lounges or elite clients. Just a quiet lobby, fluorescent lights, and the faint smell of old books and bitter coffee. She stepped inside slowly, clutching a plain canvas folder with her name typed on the front. Her badge was gone, her uniform replaced with jeans and a navy hoodie. She felt anonymous, stripped of the curated identity she had clung to for years. Inside the first room, a circle of chairs awaited. No podiums, no desks, just people. 10 strangers of all backgrounds, seated silently, each carrying their own invisible weight. Some were corporate executives, one was a police officer, another a public school teacher. All here for the same reason: they'd crossed a line and been given a second chance to face it. The instructor, a soft-spoken black man in his 50s named Harold Tran, stepped forward with quiet confidence. He didn't lecture, he didn't shame. He simply said, "Welcome. This room is for truth, not punishment. If you're not ready to be uncomfortable, you're not ready to grow." Madison sat down, and for the first time in years, she said nothing. Over the following weeks, her world unraveled and reassembled. She listened to stories from people whose names had been mispronounced their entire lives, who were followed in department stores, mistaken for assistants, treated like suspects for simply being. Stories that weren't news headlines or theoretical scenarios anymore. They were faces across from her, voices trembling with pain, eyes daring her to look away. And she didn't. Some days were unbearable, like the day they played body cam footage of black teenagers being dragged from planes. Or the guest speaker, a former flight attendant who'd quit after years of microaggressions from co-workers and passengers alike. Madison sat in the back, frozen, hands balled into fists in her lap. One afternoon, after an especially raw session on unconscious bias, Harold walked over and asked her gently, "What part of your reflection are you most afraid to see?" Madison's voice barely rose above a whisper. "That I thought I was a good person. But I was dangerous and didn't even know it." Harold just nodded. "Then that's where the work begins." Little by little, something shifted. Not performative guilt, not a desire to check a box, but a quiet hunger to understand. To become someone who didn't wait for a viral video to tell her what was wrong. To listen before she spoke, to unlearn before she taught. The badge hadn't made her powerful. This radical humility did. And for the first time in her life, Madison Clark began to feel what it was like to actually earn the right to serve. 6 months later, the world looked different through Madison Clark's eyes. She stood in front of a new class of flight attendants, young, eager, pressed in spotless Navy uniforms. This time, she wasn't leading pre-flight service drills or reciting FAA compliance codes. She was here for something deeper, something harder, to teach what nearly destroyed her. The classroom at Attendant Airways Training Center was bright but quiet. Gone were the banners about luxury in the skies and glossy posters of champagne-pouring flight crews. In their place hung framed quotes about dignity, empathy, and accountability. It was Evelyn Sinclair's doing, of course. She had rewritten the culture from the inside out, and Madison was now part of that mission. She stepped up to the front of the room, holding no notes, no tablet, only her voice. "My name is Madison Clark," she began, scanning the room with steady eyes. "I've served over 2,000 flights, flown across 3 continents, trained dozens of crew, and 6 months ago I nearly lost everything. Not because I didn't know how to serve, but because I didn't know how to see." The room shifted. Recruits exchanged curious glances. I looked at a woman and judged her. Not based on anything she said, not on her boarding pass, not even on her behavior, but on her skin, her age, and the fact that she didn't fit the image I thought first class should look like. A few eyebrows raised. The mood changed, no longer just orientation, but revelation. "That woman," Madison continued, "was Evelyn Sinclair, our CEO, our founder, and the person who could have ended my career with one sentence." She paused, letting the truth settle like a weight in the room. But she didn't. Madison walked toward the recruits, voice firmer now. "Instead, she gave me something infinitely harder, the chance to change. And that journey taught me more than any service manual ever could." She clicked the screen behind her. It lit up with a bold sentence. "Every passenger boards with invisible luggage. Respect it." The trainees leaned forward, intrigued. No one was checking their watches. "You'll be taught how to serve wine, how to manage turbulence, how to de-escalate conflict. But the most important thing you'll learn here is how to honor the humanity in everyone, especially those you think don't belong." She stopped at the front again, breathing in deeply, steady. Bias doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers through policies, glances, silence. And unless we confront it head-on, it becomes part of our service without us even knowing. A long pause. Then Madison smiled, not out of pride, but resolve. "You don't just represent this airline, you represent what it believes in. And if Evelyn Sinclair can forgive me, you can do better than I did." The class burst into quiet applause, and in that moment, Madison Clark wasn't just a former flight attendant. She was a mirror and a map, a cautionary tale and a guide forward. High above the clouds, in the quiet hum of a cruising aircraft, Evelyn Sinclair sat in seat 1A, the very seat that once became the center of a storm. A warm cup of black tea rested on the tray in front of her, untouched. She wasn't reading, wasn't working, she was thinking. 6 months had passed since the slap. since the silence, since the choice that changed more than one life. Across the aisle, Madison Clark moved quietly through the cabin, not as a flight attendant, but as a newly appointed Director of Service Culture and Equity. The transformation wasn't cosmetic, it wasn't public relations. It was earned inch by inch through sweat, reflection, and the kind of inner work most people spend a lifetime avoiding. And Evelyn had seen it, every week, every report, every conversation. She hadn't chosen to spare Madison out of sentimentality. She had done it because true leadership doesn't seek vengeance, it seeks transformation. She could have crushed a career with a single phone call. Instead, she planted a seed. And now it was growing. As Evelyn sipped her tea, she recalled one of the last things she told Madison during their final review. Grace isn't weakness, it's the strength to hold someone accountable without robbing them of the chance to rise. The world doesn't change by punishment. It changes when we make room for people to face themselves and keep going. That was the lesson, not in headlines, not in policy revisions, not even in social media apologies, but in what happens after the apology, when the cameras are off, when no one's clapping, and you still choose to do better. Madison, now moving with quiet confidence, offered a kind nod to a nervous elderly passenger struggling to stow his bag. She didn't just help, she knelt beside him, met his eyes and said, "Take your time. You belong here." Evelyn smiled faintly. It wasn't about what people say when the world is watching. It was about how they treat the invisible, the overlooked, the underestimated. That's where culture lives. That's where power either uplifts or crushes. And that's where Madison had finally chosen to stand. As the plane cruised eastward, Evelyn leaned back and let her eyes close. There were still battles ahead, still systems to challenge, still ceilings to shatter. But today was a reminder that the biggest shifts don't always start with revolutions. Sometimes they begin with a mistake, and the rare courage to own it. Because when power chooses accountability, the ripple is unstoppable. And in a sky once marred by silence and shame, Evelyn knew this flight was different. This time it was headed somewhere better. As the plane descended back toward the lights of Los Angeles, a sense of quiet filled the cabin. Not the sterile silence of indifference, but the deep, contemplative stillness that follows a storm. Evelyn Sinclair looked out the window, the clouds below her now parted, revealing the city that had once doubted her, resisted her, and ultimately bowed to her unshakable grace. But this story wasn't about Evelyn alone. It was about what happens when someone falls and chooses not to stay down. About the power of choosing humility over ego, growth over guilt, and courage over comfort. Madison Clark's transformation wasn't instant nor easy. It was a daily reckoning, a series of small, hard choices to listen when it was easier to justify, to confront herself when it was easier to point fingers, and to rebuild trust not through apologies, but through action. And Evelyn, she didn't lead through outrage. She led through stillness, through presence, through a kind of moral clarity that doesn't need to shout, because it commands attention in silence. She knew that real change doesn't begin with press conferences or social media statements. It begins with giving someone the space to confront the darkest part of themselves, and the chance to walk out of that shadow a different person. This wasn't just a story of justice, it was a story of transformation. And that's what makes it powerful. In a time where society is quick to cancel, quick to condemn, and often slow to forgive, this story dares to ask a different question. What if the real victory isn't destroying someone for their mistake, but giving them the tools to make sure it never happens again? On your watch or theirs? As you close this chapter, let it stay with you, not just as entertainment, but as reflection. Think about the moments you looked past someone, the times you assumed, the judgments you made without asking. And then ask yourself the hardest question of all. If I had Madison's second chance, would I take it? Or waste it? Because at some point, all of us will be tested. By our assumptions, by our pride, by our silence. And the way we respond will define not just who we are, but what kind of world we're building. So if this story touched you, share it. If it challenged you, sit with it. If it made you think differently, talk about it. These aren't just stories, they're mirrors. And sometimes, mirrors show us things we've spent our whole lives avoiding. But only when we look closely enough. do we finally start to see? Thank you for watching. If you believe in stories that heal, challenge, and inspire, subscribe to X Daily Stories, where every week we bring you new tales of humanity, dignity, and the power of second chances. The sky is big enough for everyone. Let's fly better, together.